Hey guys, Tarke here, and I want to make a video talking all about balance philosophy in ARPGs using Outriders as an example. And when I say balance philosophy, I mean should you buff, should you nerf, when do you step in as the developer? This game came out a week ago, and since being out, they've released their first set of patch note changes, which is just a whole bunch of nerfs, and the player base is quite unhappy, or at least pockets of the player base are quite unhappy. Before I go into the specifics and my thought process on, when should you buff, when should you nerf in what is a purely PvE, non-PvP game, I'll just quickly explain the core fundamentals of this game for my Path of Exile viewers who might have no idea what this is. Think of this basically kind of like Diablo, but with guns. There are 4 classes. Each class has different abilities they can use. You can have a loadout of 3 abilities, 8 to pick from each class. And you have class trees you can reset at any point. You've got like a gun-based tree, a utility-based tree, and then like an ability power-based tree, basically is the way to think about it. And all 4 classes fundamentally have the same kind of systems. So there's that's the core class thing. Your end game, once you've gone through the whole campaign, is you have, this is kind of like a greater rift system. Random little available, think of them like rifts will be available. When they're available, every time you complete it, you gain an expedition tier. The max is 15. Once you've done that, you then unlock like this big scary endgame raid thing. And there are timers for doing each one. So you go, let's say I went to do Time 1 Spire. Based on my expedition tier and everything, it'd be a timer for a bronze, a silver, and a gold finish. If you finish at the gold, you get the most loot. Also, once you finish the main campaign, and you can also do this while leveling, but you can go back to any part of the story at any point and regrind the quests. And there are a few systems which work a little bit like adventure mode, where there are like hunt quests that you can do all 10 of the hunt quests, and then you hand them all in, you get a big reward, and you could endlessly regrind that over and over again. So nearly everything I've mentioned has been nerfed, and people are very unhappy. So the best deterministic way to farm legendaries was to grind these hunt quests. Once you did all 10, you would get a guaranteed legendary armor. This game has legendary armor sets than just random legendary pieces. I believe all the legendary armors are part of sets, and all the legendary guns are just like one-off guns. So what a lot of people were doing is they were farming their legendary sets by spamming kind of like these bounty style quests over and over again. The devs have removed the guaranteed legendary at the end of this. Their citing for the reasoning was there were some exploit cases, guessing or probably a situation of if you like organized a group, you get like everyone to do like up to 9 quests, and then you get your group in, you do the 10 together, hand it in, jump to the next person's game. You kind of cheese it that sort of a way. So because there were like exploit cases of it, they've decided to remove the legendary thing at all. You can still like spam these and hand in to get a bunch of like epic loot at the end, but removing that legendary has upset a lot of people. And this kind of comes into that whole like Path of Exile mentality of exploit early, exploit often. The devs have also said they're not going to be punishing anyone who was exploiting the system, but they are completely removing the functionality. Now, I can completely understand the thought process from the devs. It was an unintended mechanic, and while it might have been completely viable, like from their point of view, from like the amount of loot someone will get an hour, for like letting solo players do it, if their game is built in such a way that they couldn't remove the exploits without removing the functionality completely, then yeah, that probably is the way to go. Because with games like this, they only have a finite life cycle, and with the way that knowledge kind of like proliferates, it's kind of like with chess runs in D3. It's always my go-to example of like players will always go for the easiest form of loot access. There was a thing you used to have to do in D3 where you could waypoint into a specific zone. There was a chest right next to the waypoint. You could loot the chest, reset the world, rinse, repeat, never having to ever fight a monster. And it was the best way of getting legendaries, and everyone was doing it. Then when Blizzard announced they're removing it and we knew like it'll be gone by this evening, everyone was doing it for this like period of time. It's a real issue in games like that. It does have this really negative knock-on effect though, that the best way to, like, once you make a new character, like my current class, the Pyromancer, has only recently gotten to endgame, only recently started doing the expeditions on it. My gear sucks. The best way for me to get into the endgame would have been farming those early legendary items, get some pieces together, get a set going, and then I could start ramping through the expeditions. So that's been nerfed. The next big set of nerfs is they've nerfed the strongest builds across the board. So very briefly, there is a ability, volcanic rounds. Of the 4 classes, 3 classes had this, basically a round ability. You could infuse your current magazine of bullets with this special effect and make the bullets just hit really hard. There are lots of ways in this game that you can get like infinite bullets. It's intended that you can get infinite bullets, but with the right selection of gear and everything, basically the classes that had availability to these round abilities could have 100% uptime of them, and because they gave you so much like just damage for free, it was a very easy way to get to the highest level of content with the lowest amount of gear, low barrier to entry. Everyone was doing it, and everyone was complaining like, hey, this is so much stronger than everything else. This is completely destroying the diversity of the game. And then the one class, the Devastator, which didn't have access to it, a lot of the Devastator mains were really upset because they're like, hey, why is our class left out? This sucks. Also, I will just give my opinion on it briefly. It does kind of suck that in a game all about fun spamming abilities, like the Pyromancer can like summon walls of fire and do all these cool like eruptions and volcanoes and everything. You know, you don't want to just only be a shooty game, because if you're only a shooty game, then what's the point of having the cool, you know, fire abilities? You know what I mean? So that's been hit. So it's like, okay, so they've nerfed the best builds across the board. They've also nerfed the best debuffs across the board, which that universally blanket nerfs everything. They've nerfed the best way of getting items, legendary items for the powerful set bonuses, and the Grace Rift things. They've made the 2 easiest Grace Rifts. I don't know if I have them available. Yeah, Chemplant and Boomtown was the other one. They were considered like the easiest to do, so that's the main ones people would farm the gold timers on to get the most loot. They've also made those harder because they've basically made the like time completion smaller, so you've got less time to do it, so you need an even stronger build. So basically they've just like blanket nerfed everything, and they've offered 0 buffs, and people are really upset about it. Now, there's always an interesting debate in games. We see this a lot with Path of Exile. We've seen this very recently with Path of Exile, the whole Harvest nerfs of like, when should you buff? When should you nerf? And then especially in non-competitive games, it's kind of hard to like say if this is a competitive game or not, because it is built entirely around like crossplay and having these time trial kind of things. So while 99.999% of the player base will be just, you know, playing it completely normally, not really like, oh, I've got the world record timer, like the devs have designed in a way that that's sort of there, so I could kind of understand them wanting to protect that. And also the concern that obviously if you scoped out the length of your game to last a certain period of time, it's like, okay, people will be finishing their sets within this many hours. If your entire like time economy is broken in the first week and people are like finishing everything in the first week, like, can you imagine if in Path of Exile, within not just like someone like MP's group would get like all the headhunters of everyone, like if just an average dude playing a couple of hours a night was getting that level of gear in the first week of a league, GGG would kind of have to completely reevaluate their 3-month league cycle. And that's a 3-month league cycle. This is just a game. When you buy it, that's it. They might add some DLC at some point, but like once this is done, this is done. So I can understand why the devs would be very protective of that. I'm also, I still don't know how I necessarily feel about, and this is just generally, comes much more about Path of Exile, when you get massive sweeping balance changes so early into the life cycle of a game. Obviously with this game, there is that whole concern of like, if we don't step in now, then people just burn out and they'll just exhaust all the content in too short a period of time. But with Path of Exile especially, we see this with the leagues, where a new league will come out. It'll seem really overtuned. There are ways you can build around like how deadly a league is. And people will start to build around it, but usually after a week, you will then start seeing like massive waves of nerfs coming in, nerfing down the content, so more people can engage with it. And there's always this conversation of, well, what's better? Is it better that we have this really challenging content, which maybe does push these certain meta builds? Or do we bring the content down so that then anyone can do the content, but then the meta builds face roll the content? And you can see the way they've gone with this way. Like, what they could have done is they could have been like, okay, so people are really struggling getting into these like super high levels. A lot of people are struggling getting their challenge tier 15s. Well, these bullet builds are dominating. Do we bring everything up? And I think it's a very valid line of thought, because that was the main... It's actually funny, before this like series of patch notes were announced, I was seeing threads about like how refreshing it was to have a game that didn't care that builds are broken. Because a lot of these looter shooter games, especially, they are PvE and PvP, so you have to have some level of balance. People are praising this game, like, oh, it's so great that the devs don't mind that you can hit for like 12 million. There was a clip which went viral, which was a guy getting a 12 million headshot. Meanwhile, I know people with ability builds are like struggling to get 1 million hits. And there was this massive like power strength between ability-based builds and these bullet-based builds, especially. So a lot of people were expecting, can't wait for them to announce they're going to buff up all the ability builds. Then all the ability builds can get the challenge tier 15s. Let's go. Obviously, the devs haven't gotten that way. I'm really curious to see how the player base reacts to these changes with time. Right now, like, it's only got announced a few hours ago. A lot of people are being very reactionary and like, this is the death of the game. Like, I've seen threads of this is the death of Outriders. I'm curious to see if it's going to be a situation of, do people feel differently once they've gotten their tier sets, but then they'll be like, but I can't get my tier sets, you've removed the only way to get them. I don't know, it's an interesting dynamic. Before this whole patch note thing, I was thinking about making a video talking about how players optimize the fun out of games, because this is something I definitely experienced. So before I started grinding endgame, I said to myself I wanted to get every single class through the campaign. I've got 60 hours in this game, and I've barely touched endgame, because you can see the max level is 30. I was just like taking, okay, I take a Trickster through to endgame, I'll take a Pyro through to endgame, took Devastate through to endgame, and I was like working on getting my Technomance up. So I'm kind of in this awkward situation now where I knew like a lot of the dominant strategies, like I knew what the best builds were day one, I knew what the best loot farming things. I'm like, it's fine. It's a single player game. Like, I can do this whenever I want. I'd rather just get all the classes through to end, see which one I'm vibing the most, and then I'll do all the grinding on that one. So this is quite an interesting experience for me, because usually when these sort of changes happen in Path of Exile, usually I'm like, I've already done the content. Like, usually it's one of those situations where I've done the content, and then I'm seeing people who like haven't reached maps yet, who are suffering. Whereas now I'm the guy who's kind of suffering from all these changes because I didn't get to make use of them. Like, I didn't get to make use of all the cool builds. I didn't get to farm up all my legendary sets. Like, I've got one piece of one set on my Pyromancer, and that's it, because I was just going through the campaign. So yeah, I'm really curious to hear what you guys think, and I'm also just really curious to see how the reactions to Outrider changes over the coming weeks. I will just briefly say I've really enjoyed my time with the game. I'm hoping to get hopefully another 60 hours in at least. Yeah, would recommend, although it might be a bit more of a time sink than it would have been several days ago. But yes, I'm Tarke. Have a good day. Let me know what you think of the whole, should you buff the top end, should you buff the low end, nerf the top end, buffs versus nerfs in single player games in Path of Exile. Bye-bye.